Your place is out there by the trash." Those words were thrown straight at my face in the middle of my 6-year-old grandson's birthday party. The room went silent. More than 40 people stood there, wine glasses in hand, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding, while my own son pointed toward the door as if he were chasing me off like a stranger. I looked down at the gift still wrapped in my hands. It was only a brief moment, but it was enough for me to understand that for 35 years I had raised a man who did not see me as his father at all. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back, not because I was hurt, but because something inside me had just collapsed, and something else had quietly taken its place. That night, while the whole family was still raising their glasses in celebration, I opened the safe in my office, took out a stack of documents that had never carried their names, and I began signing, one page at a time, to make sure that when they woke up, the first thing they saw would be the notice reclaiming the house and a statement showing a debt of more than $400,000 in their names. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. The party was held at an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. High ceilings with crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths pressed so smooth there wasn't a single crease. Madeline chose the place because, in her words, a child like Lucas deserves a classy birthday. I arrived 15 minutes earlier than planned, an old habit from years of running construction sites, always on time, always prepared. I wore a dark gray suit I'd owned for many years, not new but clean and well kept. In my hands was a carefully wrapped gift, a wooden puzzle set, the kind Ethan and I used to play with when he was little. I thought Lucas would like it. The moment I stepped inside, I knew I didn't belong there. Laughter filled the room, polite handshakes, conversations about stocks, real estate, upcoming vacations in Florida or California. I saw familiar faces, Ethan's former colleagues, a few young business partners, Madeline's friends I'd never met. They looked at me with polite but distant eyes, as if I were someone they had to greet out of courtesy, not respect. Lucas ran past me wearing a tiny navy blue suit, his tie slightly crooked. He smiled brightly. I bent down and called his name, but Madeline quickly pulled him back to her side, her hand resting on his shoulder instinctively as if I had crossed some invisible boundary. "Lucas, come here," she said gently but firmly. "Don't run around." I straightened up and forced a smile, telling myself I was being too sensitive. I had been telling myself that for years. Oh, the party began. The birthday cake was rolled out, 6 candles glowing under the lights. Everyone clapped and sang. I stood at the edge of the circle, quietly watching. In that moment, I remembered Ethan's 6th birthday. A small cake in a cramped kitchen, just the two of us, and a plastic toy car I had worked an extra month to afford. Ethan had hugged my leg and said it was the best birthday of his life. When the applause faded, Madeline signaled to Ethan. My son stepped forward, wineglass in hand, tapping it lightly with a spoon to get everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming," Ethan said, his voice confident, familiar from meetings and presentations. "Lucas is very lucky to have such a wonderful family and friends." I smiled, thinking it was the right moment to step closer. But Ethan wasn't finished. "We also wanted to take this opportunity to talk about an important plan," he continued. "Our family is considering moving to a different area, bigger, better for Lucas's future." Madeline stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes flicking quickly toward me. I knew what was coming. "And of course," Ethan went on, "that's a decision that requires support from family." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Eyes began turning toward me, as if I were part of a performance that had been carefully staged. I could feel the invisible pressure pressing down on my chest. "How much?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Ethan looked at me, hesitated for a split second, then named the amount. It was not small, and it had never been discussed beforehand. I didn't say no. I only said I needed time to think. That was when everything broke apart. Ethan's expression changed. Madeline cut in, her voice still sweet, but every word carried thorns. She talked about Lucas's future, about how I had everything while their young family was struggling. She spoke as if I were a stingy old man refusing to give up control. Before I could respond, Ethan lost his patience. His voice rose. The words came fast, sharp, stripped of restraint. And then that sentence was spoken, the one that severed everything. After that came silence. A silence so heavy I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner above us. No one stepped in. No one said Ethan had gone too far. I stood there holding the gift, suddenly aware of how heavy it felt. I set the box down on the nearest table, turned my back, and walked out. The glass door closed softly behind me, but in my head it sounded like it slammed shut. The parking lot was nearly empty. I got into my car, placed my hands on the steering wheel, and sat there for a long time. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry. I just felt an emptiness opening up, where there had once been an absolute belief that family was the safest place in the world. The drive home was so familiar I could have done it without thinking. Traffic lights, turns, rows of trees along the road, everything was the same, except me. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the darkness of my office, where I had spent thousands of nights calculating, signing, and building everything Ethan was now benefiting from. I switched on the desk lamp and pulled open the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. The safe was there, as it always had been, silent and patient. I opened it. The folders were neatly arranged, carefully labeled. The deed to the house, the loans in Ethan's and Madeline's names, the numbers I had quietly guaranteed for years. I sat down and picked up a pen. There was no music, no drama, just the soft rustle of paper and the sound of the pen touching the page. When the last page was signed, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. I wasn't sure how many things they would lose after that night, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't lose anything else. I sat in my office for a long time that night, after the safe was closed and the house had returned to its familiar quiet. Outside, the neighborhood was still lit, cars passing occasionally, as if nothing had happened at all. But in my mind, everything was slowly rewinding, carrying me far back, to where all my vows began. I grew up never knowing my father. My mother never spoke much about him. She only said he left when I was too young to remember, and that was enough. In our rundown rental house on the outskirts of town, it was just the two of us, and a daily routine measured by her work hours. She worked mornings at a laundromat, night shifts at a small diner, and on weekends took cleaning jobs for wealthier families. I grew used to seeing her come home late, the smell of soap and grease clinging to her sleeves, her back bent from exhaustion. I learned to take care of myself early. At night, I reheated cold food in the microwave, did my homework at an old wooden table with chipped edges, and waited to hear the jingle of keys at the door. Some nights, I pretended to be asleep so my mother wouldn't worry, even though I lay awake listening to her sigh in the kitchen. I didn't fully understand adult struggles back then, but I understood one thing. If my mother didn't collapse, I wasn't allowed to be weak. It was during those years that I made a simple vow to myself, one I believed was right. If I ever had a child, they would never have to count coins, never have to wait up late for a parent to come home, never have to grow up too soon. I would do everything I could to give my child a full, safe life, free from the feeling of being left behind that I had known. I carried that vow into adulthood. I studied seriously, worked relentlessly, never allowed myself to stray. When I met Claire, my wife, I thought life had finally begun to smile at me. She was gentle, steady, and had a way of listening that made people feel understood. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough, and more importantly, we shared a clear vision of family. Ethan was born on a morning with light rain. I still remember the feeling of holding him for the first time. A small, warm life completely dependent on me. In that instant, my old vow became vivid and real. I didn't just want my child to have enough. I wanted him to be happy. That happiness didn't last long. When Ethan was just over 2 years old, Claire fell ill. At first, it was only lingering fatigue, then endless doctor visits, and finally results no doctor could soften. I sat beside her hospital bed in a stark white room, listening to the steady hum of machines, feeling a kind of helplessness I had never known before. Claire passed away on a still afternoon. Ethan was too young to understand what was happening. He only knew that his mother no longer held him, no longer read bedtime stories. I stood at the fresh grave, holding my son's hand, and realized my life had turned onto a different road, the road of a single father. Many people urged me to remarry. They said Ethan needed a mother, that I couldn't be both parents forever. I listened, but I didn't act, not because I didn't believe in new happiness, but because I was afraid. Afraid of bringing a stranger into my son's life, afraid of disruption, afraid he would feel replaced. I thought that if I tried hard enough, I could make up for everything. So I poured my entire life into Ethan. Everything revolved around him. My work, my travel, my relationships, all came second to my son's needs. I took him to school, picked him up, sat for hours at the table helping with homework, listened to endless stories from school. I was present at every parent-teacher meeting, every sports game, every moment I could squeeze myself into. I didn't realize that in trying to do everything, I was teaching him the wrong lesson. I taught him there would always be someone behind him fixing every problem, that if he fell, I would lift him before he ever felt pain, that he never had to lack, never had to wait, never had to learn limits. I believed that enough sacrifice would earn gratitude. I believed my son would grow up, look back, and understand what I had done. I believed love, given fully, would somehow return. That belief carried me through exhaustion and loneliness in a house that felt far too large for just 2 people. But that belief also blinded me. I missed the early signs, excessive dependence, the unspoken expectation that I would always be there, always ready. I failed to see that while I thought I was protecting my son, I was actually taking away his chance to learn responsibility for his own life. Back then, I didn't think I was planting the seeds of tragedy. I thought I was doing the best a father could. I didn't know that my overprotection, my fear of letting my child lack anything, was quietly creating an invisible distance, where love was mistaken for entitlement, and sacrifice was taken for granted. Sitting alone in my office that night, I finally faced the truth I had avoided for years. It wasn't only Ethan who had changed. I had helped shape the man he became. And when I realized that, I no longer felt angry. Only a heavy, quiet weight, like discovering that the greatest mistake of your life wasn't made in a single moment, but built from thousands of small, harmless choices repeated over time. After that night, as I sat alone in my familiar office, I understood that to see how things reached this point, I couldn't look only at Ethan or Madeline. I had to look back at my own path, the one that created everything they were standing on, and the same path that planted the seeds of the collapse now beginning. Harris & Co-owner didn't start with a flashy idea or a large investment. It began with my calloused hands and an old pickup truck I bought with nearly all my savings after years of working for others. Ethan was still very young then. I needed a job that allowed flexibility, something that could support us and still let me pick him up after school. I wasn't thinking about building an empire. I was thinking about survival. In the early days, I did everything myself. I surveyed sites, poured concrete, framed structures, checked every brick and every plank. By day, I worked on site. By night, I balanced the books at the kitchen table after Ethan had gone to sleep. There were weeks I worked 7 days straight, with no concept of weekends or days off. If a project fell behind, I was the first one there and the last to leave. The city wasn't kind to new businesses. Competition was fierce, clients demanding, and one small mistake could ruin your reputation. I learned to stay quiet, do good work, and let results speak. Slowly, Harris & Coleman gained repeat clients, then bigger contracts, then projects I never imagined I could reach. It all came very slowly, no sudden leaps, just decades of hard labor, early mornings before sunrise, late nights coming home with aching backs and empty minds. I didn't buy a big house, I didn't upgrade my car. I left the money in the company, reinvesting little by little. Every dollar had a clear destination in my mind: Ethan's future. When Ethan entered college, Harris & Coleman finally stood on solid ground. I had a stable team, long-term clients, and credibility in the industry. That was when I first thought about protecting what I had built. Not to boast, but to make sure all those years wouldn't vanish because of one unexpected event. I sought out a personal lawyer, a man slightly older than me, quiet, measured. He asked many questions, not just about assets, but about family, about my relationship with my son. I remember one afternoon when he leaned back in his chair, looked at me over his glasses and said, "You don't just need a plan for death, you need a plan for life." That was when the idea of a trust fund was born. I set up a trust in Ethan's name, with an amount I knew would ensure he never had to worry about money. It wasn't all my assets, but it was what I reserved for my son, a final guarantee that I had kept my vow. At the same time, I bought Ethan a house near his workplace. On paper, it was in his name, but true ownership was held through a family trust I controlled. It was a common, legal arrangement, and at the time I saw nothing questionable about it. I thought I was being smart, reducing taxes, avoiding future legal trouble, creating stability for my son. That was when my lawyer made a suggestion I barely paid attention to at first. He mentioned a morality clause in the trust, a clause that allowed me to revoke inheritance if the beneficiary seriously violated basic standards of ethics and responsibility. I laughed. I said my son wasn't that kind of person. I said it would never be needed. My lawyer didn't laugh. He simply nodded and said something I thought was overly cautious at the time. "It's not about mistrusting your son. It's about protecting both sides, in case life doesn't go the way we hope." I signed that clause in a very different state of mind than my construction contracts. No worry, no hesitation. I saw it as an insurance policy I hoped I'd never use. To me, it was just a technical safeguard in a system built on absolute trust in my son. The years that followed were relatively smooth. Ethan graduated, joined the company, gradually took on more responsibility. I gave him work, guided him step by step, gave him the freedom to try and to fail. Every time I saw him presenting to clients, I felt proud. I thought I had done things right, that my struggles had paid off in a worthy successor. Because of that belief, I never once mentioned the morality clause. I didn't want it to exist in my child's mind. I didn't want Ethan to feel that his father's love came with conditions. I wanted him to believe that everything I gave was unconditional, rooted in family, not control. But trust, I've learned, is a lot like wealth. It has to be managed, not handed over entirely to emotion. When you place everything in someone else's hands without keeping any boundaries for yourself, you don't just give away power. You strip yourself of the ability to protect your own well-being. Sitting in my office, looking at the copies of documents neatly stored in the safe, I finally saw that bitter paradox clearly. The decisions I had made with clarity and good intentions, the safeguards I once thought unnecessary, were now the only things keeping me from completely falling apart. I didn't create them to punish anyone. I created them because I believed my son would never give me a reason to use them. Perhaps my greatest mistake wasn't setting up the trust or buying the house, and it wasn't the morality clause either. The mistake was that I placed too much trust without enough boundaries. I thought love, if it was big enough, would correct everything on its own. I thought a father didn't need layers of protection for himself. Those realizations didn't make me regret becoming successful or providing for my child. They only helped me understand that sometimes what we once considered our wisest decision becomes the only weapon that allows us to stay standing when everything starts to collapse. And I, without ever expecting to use it, had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Madeline entered Ethan's life in a way that raised no suspicion for me at first. It was an evening fundraiser for the local hospital, an annual charity event my company was one of the main sponsors of. I hadn't planned to stay long. Events like that were always loud, full of greetings and the same recycled small talk. But Ethan was different. He was at an age where he wanted to expand his network, to prove himself as more than just William Harris's son. I remember clearly the first moment I saw Madeline. She was standing near the registration table, wearing a simple cream-colored dress, not particularly eye-catching among the suits and evening gowns. Her hair was neatly tied back, her makeup light. When Ethan introduced us, she smiled at me, a measured smile, neither too warm nor distant. She said she worked in event coordination and had volunteered to help with the fundraiser because she wanted to do something meaningful. Ethan was drawn to her almost immediately. I could see it in the way he leaned toward her when they spoke, in how he laughed more than usual. After that night, Ethan told me Madeline had grown up in a family that wasn't very well off, that she had been independent from an early age, working and studying at the same time to support herself. He spoke with sympathy, even a hint of pride, about meeting a woman who didn't rely on anyone. I listened, nodded, and asked no questions. Maybe because the story felt so familiar to me. I had grown up with very little. I understood what it meant to fend for yourself. And I believed that people who had experienced hardship knew how to appreciate what they had. That was another belief I carried from my past. And once again, I placed it on someone else without verifying it. Everything moved quickly. Just a few months later, Ethan announced that he and Madeline were engaged. I was a bit surprised, but I didn't object. Ethan was grown, had a stable job, a position in the company. I thought that if my son trusted his choice, I should respect it. Madeline spoke modestly when she talked to me about the wedding. She said she didn't need anything elaborate, just a warm, simple ceremony. But those words didn't last long. As planning began, the guest list grew, the venue was upgraded, and everything gradually became bigger and more expensive. Madeline never made direct demands. She always spoke softly. Ethan deserves a truly complete day. I'm just afraid we'll look back and regret it. Those words weren't aimed at me, but I was always the one who stepped in to handle things. I paid for the wedding without hesitation. Not because I wanted to show off, but because I thought it was how I could show my support for my son. The ceremony took place at a resort outside the city, lavishly decorated with lights, fresh flowers, and a live band. Watching Ethan stand beside Madeline in his tailored suit, I felt proud. I believed I had done the right thing. Still, even that day, there were small details that made me uneasy. Some of Madeline's friends didn't look like people who had been struggling to get by, as she had described. They spoke casually about luxury trips and expensive restaurants. When I asked, offhandedly, how she knew them, she answered quickly, saying they were friends of friends, then changed the subject. I didn't push. I told myself everyone has parts of their past they don't want to fully explain. And I didn't want to be the difficult father, prying into my daughter-in-law's private life. I chose silence, trusting that time would provide answers. After the wedding, Ethan began to change. Not suddenly, but gradually. so subtly that if you weren't paying attention, you'd think it was just normal maturity. He asked for my input less often at work. Decisions he used to bring to me were now shared only after they had already been made. When I offered advice, he nodded, but his eyes were different, no longer seeking agreement, but weighing whether to listen at all. Madeline was always there, but she never confronted me directly. She didn't argue. She smiled, placed her hand over Ethan's during family meetings, or gently said, "Maybe the younger generation sees things differently." Those words sounded harmless, but they always positioned me as someone outdated, someone to be understood rather than truly heard. I began to feel pushed out of the center of my own family, though I couldn't quite name it. I reassured myself that this was just a phase, that Ethan was building his own family, and separating from his father's shadow was inevitable. I reminded myself of my own youth, my desire to make my own decisions, to prove my worth. Madeline was skillful in a way that made her hard to fault. She always called me Dad, always asked about my health, always praised me in front of others. But in very small moments, so small they were easy to dismiss, I sensed a quiet control. She set the schedules for visits. She arranged the seating at family meals. She was the one who reminded Ethan that we should head home soon, whenever our conversations lasted a bit longer than usual. I found myself slowly becoming a guest in my own son's life. And every time that thought surfaced, I pushed it aside. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that my sense of displacement was probably just me adjusting to a new role, the role of a father standing in the background. Some evenings, after Ethan and Madeline left, I sat alone in the large living room, looking at the family photos on the walls. Pictures of Ethan as a child, Claire smiling, me standing at a construction site the day Harris and Koser completed its first major project. I believed things would eventually settle, that with enough patience, everything would realign. But the truth is, not every deviation finds its way back on its own. Some changes, when ignored long enough, become the foundation for much bigger distortions. I chose trust and waiting because I didn't want to admit that I might have misjudged someone, and I didn't want to admit that my son might be slowly guided down a path I could no longer control. Looking back, I understand that Madeline didn't enter Ethan's life with noise or confrontation. She entered with gentleness, with stories that made others want to protect her by standing half a step behind. Enough not to appear threatening, yet enough to quietly shape the direction of everything around her. And I, in my desire to keep the peace, convinced myself that all those signs were temporary. I told myself again and again that this was just a phase, that Ethan would realize it, that things would balance out. I didn't know that the moment I chose that reassurance, the wheels had already begun to drift off the tracks, slowly, silently, but irreversibly. Lucas was born on a spring morning, just as the trees lining the road outside the hospital were beginning to sprout new buds. Ethan called me before it was fully light outside, his voice trembling with excitement. I remember standing still in the kitchen for a few seconds, a steaming cup of coffee still in my hand, before telling him I was on my way. The first time I held Lucas, the feeling was strangely familiar. He was so small, his skin rosy, eyes tightly shut, his breathing steady and warm. In that moment, I didn't think about the underlying tensions, or the changes in Ethan, or the things that unsettled me about Madeline. I only felt that life had somehow given me another chance to love without restraint. I became a grandfather in the truest sense, almost instinctively. I visited Lucas often, sometimes just to watch him sleep in his crib. I bought little things I thought he might need, not because anyone asked, but because I wanted to. Each time Lucas wrapped his tiny hand around my finger, something inside me softened. Some forms of love need no explanation, and for me, Lucas was exactly that. The first months passed peacefully. I watched Ethan awkwardly learn how to be a father, Madeline learning how to be a mother. I stayed in the background, ready to help when asked. I believed my role was clear, present, but not intrusive. I didn't realize that once boundaries blur, they are very hard to redefine. The first request came gently. Ethan said the car they were using wasn't safe enough for a newborn. I didn't ask questions. I wrote the check. I told myself it was reasonable. Everyone wants to protect their child. Then came Lucas's room. Madeline said he needed a better space, quieter, brighter, healthier. She spoke with sincere concern, as if every decision revolved around his well-being. I nodded again. I didn't feel like I was giving too much. I believed I was doing the right thing. Every request after that came wrapped the same way. An early education program because Lucas shows signs of being very smart. A short getaway because postpartum stress isn't good for the family environment. A small renovation because he needs a safe space to learn to walk. Each time I listened, considered briefly, and agreed. I didn't want to be the one who said no to anything labeled as Lucas's future. I grew accustomed to transferring money without asking too many questions. Numbers appeared on documents, then disappeared from my account, forming a new rhythm. I didn't see it as loss. I saw it as investment, not in real estate or stocks, but in a child I loved unconditionally. But with each check, something else quietly shifted. Conversations grew shorter. Ethan rarely asked for my opinion anymore, even on matters he once always brought to me. Madeline began speaking for him in discussions about money, her voice still gentle but always conclusive. I realized I was no longer being asked, "What do you think, Dad?" I was simply being told, "We've decided." I couldn't quite name that feeling. At least at the time, it didn't feel like exploitation. I thought it was just a natural result of my son having his own family. I comforted myself by believing I didn't need public gratitude for what I gave. But respect, I slowly came to understand, isn't always shown in words. It lives in whether people listen to you, whether they pause to consider your perspective. And those things were quietly fading away. Once, during dinner, I gently suggested they might slow down their spending. Ethan stayed silent. Madeline smiled and said, "I didn't understand the pressures of raising a child in this era." She spoke as if I had lived too long in a different world, no longer relevant. I didn't argue. I didn't want to fight over what I thought was temporary. I didn't realize that every time I stayed silent, I was reinforcing a new pattern. A pattern where Lucas became the legitimate reason for every request, and I became the default resource to fulfill them. I didn't see myself being manipulated. I saw myself fulfilling the role of a loving grandfather. Some evenings, driving home after visiting Lucas, I felt a gentle happiness. I thought I was lucky to still be able to give. I didn't know that happiness was mixed with something else, a quiet expectation that I would always say yes, always be there, always open my wallet when needed. Love, without boundaries, is easily reshaped by others. I couldn't see that then. I only saw a child growing day by day, and I wanted to be part of that journey. I didn't realize that, to some people, that love was gradually becoming a tool. A lever used skillfully and gently, so subtly that the person being influenced never felt the pressure until it was too late. Looking back, I understand now that I missed the early signs, not because I lacked experience, but because I didn't want to see them. I chose to believe every decision came from good intentions. I chose to believe my love was too strong to be exploited. And that very choice opened a door that, once crossed, was extremely hard to close. Through all of this, Lucas remained an innocent child. He had no idea his presence was being used as a reason, a shield, a foundation for ever-growing demands. And I, afraid of hurting him, inadvertently allowed everything else to drift further from the path I once believed was right. Cracks don't appear all at once. They come slowly, in pieces, like fine lines on old concrete. Only when you stand still long enough do you realize they're spreading. I discovered Ethan's debt on an entirely ordinary afternoon. There was no drama, no warning sign. I was simply reviewing some financial reports related to the company and personal guarantees I had signed in the past, a habit of someone accustomed to living by numbers. Among the paperwork was a copy of a credit report I requested periodically, not out of suspicion, but because I always believed prevention was better than repair. The numbers made me stop. They weren't large enough to shock, but they were impossible to ignore. Credit card debt, a high-interest personal loan, several late payments. I read it again, slowly, as if hoping I had misunderstood. Ethan wasn't short on money. I knew that better than anyone. I had made sure my son always had a solid financial foundation. So where had this debt come from? That evening, I called Ethan over to the house. I didn't accuse him of anything. I simply placed the report on the table, turned it toward my son, and asked one simple question. Ethan looked down at the papers, then back at me. For a brief moment, I saw something flash in his eyes. Not shame, but irritation. "Where did you get this?" he asked. That question made me pause. Not because of what it asked, but because of how it sounded. It didn't sound like the Ethan I used to know. I told him it was a routine report, that I only wanted to understand what was going on. I said that if he was struggling, I could help find a solution. Ethan didn't sit down. He stood there with his arms crossed, as if shielding himself from an invisible attack. He said they were just temporary expenses, that I shouldn't interfere in his private life. I reminded him that those debts didn't affect only him. They were tied to guarantees I had signed in the past. That was when his voice sharpened. Not loud, but cutting. He said I was always trying to control things, that I didn't trust my own son. Those words weren't heavy accusations, but they cut deeper than I expected. I realized this was the first time we were talking to each other from completely different positions. The conversation ended without an apology and without a solution. Ethan left earlier than usual. I stayed behind, staring at the empty chair across from me, feeling a very different kind of exhaustion. Not from work, but from the distance that had just opened between father and son. A few days later, Madeline stopped by. She brought a basket of fruit, smiled gently, asked about my health. She said Ethan was under a lot of stress, that being a father and balancing work and family wasn't easy. She spoke in a conciliatory tone, as if trying to smooth everything over. But there was something in the way she looked at me that made me uneasy. Her eyes didn't carry gratitude or concern, but a cold calculation, carefully concealed. When I said I only wanted Ethan to be more transparent, Madeline nodded but promised nothing. She said, "Every family has its own way of handling money." That sentence was what made me start paying closer attention. Not with panic, but with the awareness of someone who has lived long enough to know that when things become vague, the truth often hides in the smallest details. Another afternoon, when I stopped by their house to bring a few things for Lucas, I overheard part of a conversation. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was standing in the hallway, about to knock on the living room door, when Madeline's voice drifted out from the kitchen. She was on the phone, her voice low but clear. "Don't worry," she said. "He's easy to manipulate. Just mention Lucas, and that's enough." I froze, not because I was afraid of being discovered, but because those words hit me straight in the chest. I didn't step inside. I didn't leave right away either. I stood there for a few more seconds, long enough to be sure I hadn't misheard. Then I turned around and left the house in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sentence kept looping in my mind, not loudly but relentlessly. Easy to manipulate. Those two words cast a different light over every recent memory. The requests, the reasons centered around Lucas, the times I nodded without much thought. I didn't want to believe it, but I could no longer brush it aside the way I used to. From that day on, I began to observe more closely, not with obvious suspicion, but with quiet attention. I noticed how Madeline steered conversations, how she answered on Ethan's behalf, how skillfully she closed off topics that might lead to questions. I noticed that whenever money came up, Lucas was always brought into the conversation, like a perfect shield. I also noticed that Ethan was becoming less and less proactive in talking to me. When I called, his replies were short. When we met, he always seemed in a hurry. I wondered whether he realized what was happening, or whether he too was being carried along a trajectory he no longer controlled. Eventually, I did something I had never imagined doing before. I hired someone to check into things, not because I wanted to expose anyone, but because I needed the truth. The person I hired wasn't a movie-style private detective, just a financial professional experienced in background checks and public records. I made it clear I didn't want to invade anyone's privacy illegally. I just wanted to understand the full picture. What he brought back wasn't definitive proof, but fragments. Gaps in Madeline's past, relationships that were never mentioned, financial shifts that didn't quite match the hardship story she had told. Nothing big enough to conclude anything on its own, but enough that I could no longer keep my eyes closed. I sat in my office, spreading those fragments out in front of me, and felt a familiar sensation return, the feeling of a man standing before an unfinished structure, knowing something isn't right, even if he can't yet see the full crack. That instinct had saved me from many bad business decisions before. And now it was knocking again, quietly but insistently. I didn't act right away. I wasn't ready to confront it yet, but I knew I couldn't go back to how things were. Once you see a crack, you can't pretend the wall is still intact, and inside me, a quiet anxiety began to grow, not just for my assets or reputation, but for the family I had always believed was the safest place in the world. After the first pieces appeared, I could no longer deceive myself. There was a truth hiding somewhere behind the curtain Madeline had drawn, and I knew that if I didn't pull it back myself, I would live forever in a state of half-belief and half-doubt, the most dangerous state for someone who had spent his life making decisions based on clarity. The man I hired came back to see me on a cloudy morning. He didn't look tense or dramatic. He simply placed a thin folder neatly on the table and gave me a cautious look, as if he understood that what he was about to say wouldn't be easy to hear. I told him to be direct. I had gone too far to stop at careful phrasing. Madeline hadn't been married just once, as she had told Ethan. There had been 2 previous marriages, both brief, both ending quietly. No media attention, no public scandals, but leaving very clear traces in legal records. Both men were significantly older than her. Both had their own assets, and after each divorce, Madeline walked away with substantial financial settlements. There were no prolonged lawsuits, no public disputes. Everything had been handled so cleanly, it was unsettling. I turned each page slowly, not because I'd never seen stories like this before. I'd encountered all kinds of people in business, but because I didn't want to believe my daughter-in-law carried a past so carefully arranged. The years, the addresses, the names, they all existed, yet had been perfectly concealed from her current life. One detail caught my attention more than the rest. Between those 2 marriages, one name appeared repeatedly in related records. Daniel. Not a husband, not a lawyer, not a relative, just a name noted in a few financial transactions, a few old contact addresses, a few accounts with regular interactions. Too regular to be coincidence. I didn't ask the investigator anything more about Daniel. I needed time to think. I needed to re-examine the past months under a different light. And that light, whether I wanted to admit it or not, was now shining more directly on Madeline. I began to notice her phone calls. Before, I'd never paid attention. Everyone deserves privacy. But now, small details felt different. Madeline often stepped out onto the balcony or into the bathroom to take calls. Her voice dropped lower than usual, her sentences short and decisive. When I entered the room, the calls often ended abruptly. Once, when I arrived earlier than planned to take Lucas to the park, I saw Madeline standing in the backyard with her back to the door, phone pressed to her ear. She didn't hear me. I wasn't trying to listen, but some words can't help but carry when you're only a few steps away. "Not yet," she said. "Everything's still on track. Just be patient." That word, plan, hovered in my mind all day. I began to ask myself, what plan? And for whom? That evening, I sat alone in my office for a long time. I didn't turn on the main lights. Only the desk lamp illuminated the scarred wooden surface worn smooth by years. I was no longer at an age where I could act on emotion. If something was happening behind my back, I needed facts, not guesses. I bought a small recording device, a legal one, used only in spaces I owned. I didn't do it impulsively. I thought long and hard before deciding. This wasn't something I was proud of, but I no longer had another option. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking truth. The first recordings revealed nothing unusual, just everyday conversations, casual check-ins. I nearly laughed at myself for being overly suspicious. But gradually, that familiar voice began to reveal another side, colder, more clipped, stripped of its usual gentle layer. Daniel appeared in the calls as if it were natural. No introductions, no explanations. They spoke like two people who had known each other for a long time, who had already agreed on everything. And then, on one evening I will never forget, I heard a sentence that made my hands tremble despite my effort to stay calm. "We just need to wait a little longer," Madeline said. "He's not that young anymore. Everything will belong to Ethan, and then things will be easier." I sat motionless, headphones pressed to my ears. I wanted to believe I had misheard, but Daniel replied, his quiet laugh cold. "Are you sure? What if he changes his mind?" Madeline was silent for a few seconds, then said something that froze the air in the room. "He won't have time." I took off the headphones, set them on the desk, and sat there for a long time. I didn't panic. I didn't shout. I just felt a vast emptiness open in my chest, where trust had once lived. The words, "waiting for him to die," weren't spoken outright, but their meaning was unmistakable. From that moment on, everything I had found confusing began to rearrange itself into a terrifying picture. The increasingly frequent financial demands, being pushed out of decisions, the quiet control, and Lucas, the child placed at the center of every story, an emotional anchor no one could refuse. Another sentence from a different recording chilled me even more. Madeline said very calmly, "The boy looks more like you than he does him." I didn't understand right away, but a deep unease spread through me. I began looking at Lucas differently, not with suspicion, but with confusion. I scolded myself for the thought, but once it appeared, I couldn't erase it. I was facing a choice I never imagined I'd have to make. If I stayed silent, I could preserve the appearance of peace, at least for a while. If I acted, I would shatter everything, not just my relationship with my son, but the image of family I had spent my life building. I looked at the photo of Lucas on my desk. He was smiling brightly, unaware of adult schemes. I knew that whatever the truth was, Lucas was innocent. But I also knew that if I didn't confront this truth, I wouldn't just be betraying myself, I'd be putting everything at risk. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my office, listening to every recording again, every word, every pause between words. Each time the picture grew clearer and more painful. I no longer doubted that a long-term plan was underway, a plan centered on the assets I had built, the life I had lived, and the death they believed would come soon enough for everything to fall neatly into place. When dawn began to break, I knew I couldn't go back to how things were. This truth wasn't meant for the faint of heart, and I was no longer someone who could avoid it. I stood at the threshold of a decision that would change everything. And though my heart was heavy, a part of me, the part that had carried me through years of hardship, was waking up cold and clear, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The decision to collect a DNA sample didn't come as an impulsive act. It came after many nights of sitting alone, staring at Lucas's photo on my desk, trying to find something familiar in his face that I had always assumed was there. I asked myself whether I was going too far, whether this suspicion was turning me into someone I didn't want to be. But every time I remembered the whispered calls, the cold remarks about waiting a little longer, my instincts rose again, refusing to let me turn back. I hated myself during those days, hated myself for doubting a child, hated myself for letting those thoughts intrude on the love I felt for Lucas. But I also knew that if I didn't face the truth, I would be trapped forever in a dangerous gray zone, where every decision could become a fatal mistake. At my age, I didn't have many chances left to correct things. I waited for the right moment. Not because I needed secrecy, but because I needed to do it discreetly, without hurting Lucas. One afternoon, when Madeline was busy and Ethan hadn't come home yet, I picked up Lucas as usual. We sat in the living room, he absorbed in his building blocks, while I pretended to read the newspaper. Everything felt so normal that I almost forgot why I was there that day. When Lucas ran into the bathroom to wash his hands before dinner, I noticed his small comb on the shelf. I stood still for a few seconds, placing my hand on the table to steady myself. In that moment, I felt as if I were betraying everything I had ever believed in. Then I thought of the words I had heard, of the long-term plan that had unknowingly placed me at its center, and I knew I had no other choice. I took the comb carefully, as if touching something fragile. A few strands of hair were caught between the teeth. I placed them into a small envelope, my hands trembling slightly. No one saw me. No one knew what I was doing. But inside me, a storm was forming, silent and violent. That night, I sent the sample to a reputable lab, using my own name. I told no one. Not out of shame, but because I wasn't ready to pull anyone else into the vortex when I didn't yet know what I would face. I told myself the results would come soon, and whatever they were, I had to be calm enough to accept them. The days of waiting were the longest of my life. I still saw Lucas, still smiled with him, still played the role of the gentle grandfather as if nothing had changed. But inside, I felt like I was living two parallel lives. One on the outside, where everything looked the same, and one on the inside, where every memory was being questioned. I began looking at Lucas more closely, not with suspicion, but with a painful uncertainty. There were details I had never noticed before. The color of his eyes, the way he frowned when concentrating, a smile that tilted slightly to one side. Things I once dismissed as coincidence now stood out uncomfortably. I scolded myself for letting those thoughts in, but I couldn't stop them. The day the results arrived was a quiet morning. I opened the envelope in my office, sunlight filtering through the window and settling on the darkened wooden desk worn smooth by time. I read each line slowly, as if moving slowly enough might change what was written. But it didn't. It lay there, cold and unmistakable, allowing no other interpretation. Probability of biological relation, almost 0. I read it again, then a third time. The number didn't change. Lucas did not share my blood, and that meant a truth even larger, even more painful. Lucas was not Ethan's biological son. I sank into my chair, feeling as if all the weight had drained from my body. There was no loud sound, no dramatic collapse, just an emptiness spreading from my chest, as if the air had been pulled from the room. I thought of all the afternoons I'd spent playing with Lucas, the way he called me in his clear little voice, the plans I had once made for his future. All of it was still there, but its meaning had been permanently altered. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't in pain, but because the pain was too great to spill out as tears. I simply sat there, staring at the paper, letting the truth sink into every thought. The next part of the report chilled me even more. As part of its procedure, the lab had compared the sample against an open database. A name appeared in the suggested matches: Daniel. Not a stranger. The very name I had heard again and again in Madeline's secret phone calls. Everything fell into place in my mind without needing further explanation. Daniel wasn't just behind the calls. He wasn't just part of the plan. He was Lucas's biological father. I felt a wave of nausea rise, not from disgust, but from the cruelty of the entire story. A child born from a secret relationship, placed into another family like a perfect chess piece, used to deceive, to stir emotion, to make me open my wallet whenever needed. I couldn't blame Lucas. He had never chosen this, but I could no longer deny that I had been systematically deceived. The dangerous connections behind it all were becoming clear. Daniel wasn't just a lover. He was a link in a long, patient, carefully calculated plan. A plan in which I, with my assets, my age, and the blind trust of an aging father, was the final target. I held the DNA results in my hand, feeling as if I were holding my entire family in a single thin sheet of paper. Just one page, yet powerful enough to erase what I had once believed to be the most solid foundation of my life. In that moment, I understood that I had lost my family in the most painful way, not through death or an obvious separation, but through truth. Yet at the same time, I realized something else. Even as everything had just collapsed, I was no longer in the dark. Truth, no matter how brutal, was the only thing that gave me the right to choose. I was no longer being guided by carefully told stories, by selectively shed tears, by the image of a child used as an emotional shield. I folded the paper, placed it into an envelope, and locked it in the safe in my office, together with the other documents I had gathered. I knew that from this moment on, every decision I made would no longer be based on hope or blind emotion. I had lost a great deal on a single sheet of paper, but in return, I held the truth, the very thing they had worked so hard to hide for so long. And when a man my age finally looks the truth straight in the eye, not to seek revenge but to protect himself, everything around him begins to take on a different shape. I didn't know where the future would lead me, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not let this truth be buried, and I would not allow myself to remain a pawn in someone else's game. The birthday party was held again on a weekend evening at the very restaurant where my family had once celebrated important milestones. The setting was elegant, warm yellow lights, white tablecloths, the sound of laughter mixed with clinking glasses. Everything was arranged so perfectly that an outsider would think this was a happy, complete family without a single crack. I arrived on time. Not early, not late. I dressed simply, a dark suit, no tie. In my jacket pocket, I carried nothing but my phone and my wallet. No folders, no paperwork. The most important things had already been secured elsewhere, long before. I walked into the banquet room with a strange sense of calm, as if I were attending a ceremony that no longer directly belonged to my life. Lucas ran over and hugged my leg the moment he saw me. He smiled brightly, completely innocent. I bent down and ruffled his hair, catching the familiar scent of shampoo, and in that moment something tightened in my chest. Whatever the truth was, Lucas was still just a child. I didn't allow myself to forget that, not even for a second. Ethan stood not far away, holding a glass of wine and talking with a few acquaintances. He glanced at me, gave a quick nod, then turned away. Madeline was different. She walked over, her smile perfectly measured, her eyes scanning me as if checking something already under control. She greeted me softly, exchanged a few polite words, then turned back to the other guests, leaving me standing alone beside the gift table. I set down the small gift I had brought and found a seat along the edge of the room. I didn't want to be the center of attention. I only wanted to observe, and it didn't take long for things to begin unfolding exactly the way I had already anticipated, deep down. When the party reached its main moment, Ethan stood up and tapped his glass lightly to draw attention. The room gradually fell silent. He spoke a few words about Lucas, about the joy of being a father, about family responsibility. The words flowed smoothly, clearly prepared, enough to earn polite applause. Then, as if following a calculated transition, his gaze shifted toward me. "Dad," Ethan said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think this is the right time to talk about something important." I didn't respond. I just looked at him and waited. Ethan continued, his voice growing firmer. He talked about financial pressure, about the cost of raising a child these days, about big plans for Lucas's future. Every sentence was carefully chosen, every word aimed at a single point, the expectation that I would do what I had always done before. Then the number was stated. No beating around the bush, no privacy. A large sum, clearly announced in front of more than 40 people in the room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Eyes turned toward me, curious, expectant, as if they were watching a performance whose ending they assumed they already knew. I felt that pressure clearly, not because of the amount, but because of the setting. Ethan had chosen this place, this moment, and this crowd deliberately. He knew I hated embarrassing others. He knew I didn't like saying no in front of people. And he believed that, like every other time, I would give in to preserve appearances. I didn't answer right away. I looked around the room at familiar and unfamiliar faces, people who had shaken my hand, praised me, indirectly benefited from my generosity. No one spoke. No one asked a question. They were all just waiting to see what I would do. Ethan began to lose patience. His voice rose slightly, not enough to be called shouting, but enough to carry the frustration that had been building for a long time. He said I didn't understand his generation, that I had too much already, that I lived alone in a large house while his family had to calculate every expense. Those words weren't new. I had heard them in many forms, for months. Madeline stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort. But I saw clearly the fleeting satisfaction in her eyes. She didn't need to speak. She only needed to stand there and let everything unfold according to the script that had been written. "Why are you silent?" Ethan asked, his voice now openly challenging. "You're always like this, controlling with silence." I stood up, not hurriedly, not angrily, just stood, and once again the room fell quiet. I intended to say that this wasn't the right place to discuss this. I intended to suggest talking privately, but Ethan didn't give me that chance. He stepped forward, pointed at me, and said the sentence that I knew from that moment on made everything irreparable. "You're just trash," he said. "Your whole life, all you know how to do is hoard money. You're worth nothing except what's in your wallet." The words didn't explode like a blast. They dropped into the room like a heavy object, freezing the air. I heard a few sharp breaths. I saw Lucas standing behind Madeline, eyes wide, not understanding what was happening. I looked at Ethan. I no longer saw my son. I only saw a man unloading all his resentment, ambition, and dependence onto a target that had always been there. I opened my mouth, but before I could say anything, Madeline stepped forward. She didn't scream, she didn't curse. She simply used both hands to push lightly, but enough to make me step back, lose my balance for a brief moment. The gesture was quick, decisive, and carried out in front of everyone. "You should leave," Madeline said coldly. "You're ruining my child's party." My child. Those two words echoed in my mind like a bitter confirmation of everything I already knew. I straightened myself. I looked around the room one last time. No one came forward. No one said this had gone too far. No one put a hand on my shoulder, not even to stop me. That silence spoke louder than any words. It told me exactly how small my place had become in that room, in that family. I adjusted my jacket, an old habit when I needed to regain composure. I looked at Lucas one more time. He was still confused, tears welling in his eyes. I gave him a very slight nod, a wordless goodbye, then turned away. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I had said enough in my own way a long time ago. The door closed behind me, cutting off the sounds of the party, the music, the forced laughter. Ahead of me was the cool night air, strangely quiet. I walked slowly toward my car, each step carrying me farther away from a life I had once believed was mine. I didn't feel ashamed. I didn't feel angry. I felt absolute clarity, the very thing I had been searching for so long. When I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, I knew I had crossed a line I could never return from. But for the first time in many years, I also knew that my next decisions would no longer be shaped by pressure, manipulation, or fear of loss. I had already lost enough, and I had no intention of losing anything else. That night, I didn't turn on the main lights in the house. I sat in my office with only the desk lamp illuminating the wood surface darkened by years. Outside the window, the city seemed to grow quiet, as if holding its breath. I set my car keys on the desk, took off my watch, removed my jacket. Those familiar motions helped keep my breathing steady, kept my mind from drifting back to the images from the restaurant. I opened the safe. The metal door swung open with a soft, familiar sound, one I had heard countless times over decades. Inside were neatly arranged folders, not placed there by chance. I took out a gray file and set it on the desk. My fingers touched the edge of the paper, the cool sensation sharpening my focus more than any cup of coffee could. I reread the morality clause once more, even though I knew nearly every word by heart. It was written in dry legal language, emotionless, without judgment, and precisely because of that, it was fair. The clause wasn't meant to punish. It was created to protect assets, to protect values, and to protect me from things I never imagined I would have to face. I called my lawyer early the next morning. His voice was as calm and steady as always. I spoke briefly, without circling around the point. I said I wanted to activate the morality clause. There was a short silence on the other end of the line, long enough for me to know he understood exactly what that meant. He asked if I was sure. I told him I had been sure before I even picked up the phone. No hesitation. No lingering hope that things would somehow fix themselves. I didn't talk about feelings. I talked about events, about public behavior, about the evidence that had been gathered. All of it was sufficient to trigger the clause legally, without dispute. The inheritance trust was frozen that same day. I received confirmation by email, a brief, impersonal notice. The numbers were still there, but they no longer belonged to Ethan's future. I felt no satisfaction. I only felt a clear sense of closure, like shutting a door that had been left open too long in the cold. The repossession of the house happened faster than I expected. The paperwork had been prepared long ago, waiting only for a final signature. The house was owned by the family trust, not by Ethan, no matter how much he had believed otherwise. I signed the repossession notice with a firm hand. No shaking, no hesitation, 30 days to vacate, no more, no less. I also signed the decision to remove Ethan from the company. Not because I wanted to destroy my son's career, but because I could no longer allow someone who had lost basic ethical boundaries to hold authority in an organization I was responsible for. The decision was drafted carefully, following proper procedure, not personal in nature. It simply reflected reality. Ethan was no longer qualified. When all the documents had been sent, I sat alone for a long time. I didn't feel empty. I felt light, as if an invisible burden had finally been set down. The confrontation between father and son took place a few days later at the lawyer's office. I didn't choose my home. I didn't choose the company. I chose neutral ground, where every word carried legal weight and wasn't distorted by emotion. Ethan arrived late. He looked exhausted, tense, yet still held on to his familiar confidence, the very trait I once mistook for maturity. He began with anger. He asked why I had done this, why I was destroying his life over one party. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish. When he stopped, I placed the thin folder in front of him. I said nothing. I simply slid it toward him. Ethan opened it. First, the notice freezing the inheritance trust. Then the repossession notice. Then the decision removing him from the company. I watched his face grow paler by degrees, though defiance still lingered in his eyes. He looked up, about to say something, when I placed 2 more items on the table: the DNA test results and a small USB drive. "Look for yourself," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. Ethan picked up the paper and read, first confusion, then disbelief, then panic. He shook his head, said it couldn't be true. I didn't argue. I simply nodded for the lawyer to play the recording. Madeline's voice filled the quiet room, clear and merciless. The talk of waiting, of the plan, of everything belonging to Ethan when I wouldn't have time anymore. And then the name Daniel appeared, familiar, needing no explanation. Ethan sat frozen. His shoulders slumped as if something holding him upright had just been pulled away. I watched the collapse unfold slowly, but irreversibly. Not the collapse of money, but of trust. I had seen that look once before, in the mirror many years ago when my mother died. I knew how much it hurt. He began to cry, not loudly, just restrained breaths, trembling hands. He said he hadn't known, that he had been deceived, that all he wanted was a stable family. I believed him, to a degree, but belief at this point was no longer enough to change anything. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes red. He said I was his father, that I couldn't abandon him like this. He said he would fix things, that he would confront Madeline, that he would do whatever it took to get back what he had lost. I listened without interrupting. When he finished speaking, the room fell silent again. "I'm not saving you anymore," I said quietly. Not because I no longer loved my son, but because I understood that if I kept saving him, I would keep destroying both of us. There are lessons that cannot be learned when someone is always standing behind you to break the fall. I told Ethan that the decisions had been made and would not be changed, that I would not use my money or my power to shield him from choices he had made himself, that he had to face the consequences and his own life, fully, for the first time. Ethan didn't argue anymore. He just nodded, very slowly. I don't know how much he truly understood in that moment, but I knew I had said what needed to be said, not in anger, but with a clarity it had taken me far too many years to regain. When the meeting ended, I stood up first. I didn't look back. I walked out of the office, the midday sunlight shining straight into my eyes, harsh but real. I knew that from this moment on, the road ahead for Ethan would be very difficult. But I also knew that for the first time in my life as a father, I had not chosen the easiest path. I chose the most honest one I could. Madeline disappeared faster than I expected. There was no goodbye, no explanation. Just one morning, when Ethan returned to the house that was no longer his, she was gone. Some clothes had been taken in a hurry, a few drawers left empty, and the joint account was nearly drained. The way she left was exactly like the way she had entered our lives, quiet, calculated, leaving behind no trace of emotion. Ethan called me that afternoon. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the arrogance and anger it once carried. He said only one short sentence: "Madeline is gone." I didn't ask anything else. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew that questions no longer mattered. When someone has lived an entire life built on deception, their departure rarely carries the whole truth with it. But the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, always finds a way to surface. The evidence I had gathered didn't stop at protecting myself. It opened up a chain of things Madeline had done over many years, not only to my family, but to others before us. Money from unclear sources, forged documents, other names that had appeared in her past, then vanished after assets were transferred. Law enforcement became involved quietly, nothing like the movies. There were no dramatic arrests in front of cameras, just phone calls, discreet meetings, files opened and stacked one after another. I cooperated fully, not with a desire for revenge, but with the exhaustion of someone who simply wanted everything to end the right way. Ethan was called in for questioning multiple times. He wasn't treated as a mastermind, but he was no longer seen as an innocent bystander either. The truth came out in fragments, enough for him to understand that over the years, he hadn't just lost money. He had lost control of his own life. He lost the house, lost his position at the company, lost the respect of people who had once called him a partner, a leader. Relationships that seemed solid fell apart quickly once money and power were gone. For the first time, Ethan was forced to face a bare reality. He didn't know who he was without something to lean on. I watched that collapse from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a very quiet sadness. No father wants to see his child hit rock bottom, but no father can live his child's life forever. I chose not to intervene, not because I was cruel, but because I knew that any rescue now would only prolong the old cycle. When everything involving Madeline was gradually dealt with, I turned back to my own life. The company, the thing I had spent more than 40 years building, no longer held the meaning it once did. I no longer wanted it tied to my family name, to memories that had grown too heavy to carry. I sold the company in a transparent deal at its true market value, no prolonged negotiations, no regret. When I signed the transfer agreement, I felt as though I were closing a very long chapter of my life. Not the chapter of success, but the chapter of attachment so deep that I had forgotten myself. A large portion of the proceeds I donated to charities, not to atone, not to seek praise. I simply wanted what I had created to be used to help people who truly needed it, people who did not treat kindness as a tool. I chose organizations that built homes for low-income families, programs that supported elderly people living alone, people like my mother once was, like I had been decades ago. The old house no longer held me either. Every room was filled with too many memories, Ethan's laughter as a child, my wife's voice in the kitchen, evenings that once felt complete. I sold it without looking back. I didn't want to live in a museum of things that were gone. I moved away carrying very little, a few books, an old watch, photographs I wasn't ready to throw away, but didn't want to see every day. I chose another place to live. Not too far, but far enough that no one would find me easily unless they truly needed to. My new life had nothing glamorous about it. I woke up early. I walked, I read, I cooked simple meals. I began to get used to silence, the very thing I had avoided for years because I was afraid of facing myself. Some evenings I sat alone and thought about Ethan, not with anger, but with a quiet regret. I didn't know whether he would stand back up. I didn't know whether he would learn anything from all that loss. But for the first time, I allowed myself not to be responsible for the answer. When everything collapses, you learn what truly remains. For me, it wasn't money. It wasn't reputation. It wasn't even the role of father I had clung to. What remained was calm, the rare feeling of knowing you've done everything you could and that the rest is no longer in your hands. I stepped into this new life not with excitement, but with acceptance. At this age, acceptance itself is a kind of freedom. The coastal town where I chose to stop wasn't special from the outside, just a stretch of low houses painted in soft colors, tucked behind old maple trees, facing the sea. In the morning, a thin mist drifted slowly over the water. In the afternoon, the wind carried the scent of salt and the cries of seabirds. No one here knew who I used to be, and to me, that was a gift. I lived in a small house, just enough for one person. No extra rooms, no unnecessary decorations, a wooden table by the window overlooking the ocean, a reading chair, a single bed. Everything had its place, and nothing existed just to fill space. I woke early, made coffee, sat quietly watching the waves. Some mornings, I thought of nothing at all. I just breathed. I just existed. It was a feeling I hadn't had in many years. Here I wasn't a CEO, not a founder, not Mr. Harris in tense meetings. I was just William, an older man living alone, walking every afternoon, greeting neighbors with a nod, sometimes stopping to exchange a few words about the weather. No one asked what I used to do. No one expected me to become anything for them. I carried no title, and I didn't need anyone to confirm my worth. Letters still arrived regularly during the first few months. I didn't open all of them. Some I recognized as Ethan's handwriting the moment I saw the envelope. Some were just a few short lines, saying he was trying, that he understood, that he hoped one day I would reply. I placed them in a drawer, not because I hated him, but because I knew that replying too soon would pull me back into the old cycle, a cycle of unripe hope, of words that hadn't yet had enough time to become real change. I heard about Ethan through others, not directly, that he had moved to a smaller place, that he went to work regularly, that he was learning to take care of things he had never thought about before, that he took his child to school and picked him up on time, cooked dinner himself. The news came in fragments, incomplete, but enough for me to understand that life was teaching him in a way I had, for many years, unknowingly prevented. One afternoon, while reorganizing my bookshelf, I found a small item I had brought from the old house, an old toy car, the paint chipped, the wheels worn. I remembered buying it for Ethan when he was 6, on a night I came home late from a long business trip. He ran that little car around the living room, laughing, while I sat on the floor playing with him until well past midnight. The memory didn't hurt. It was quiet, like a distant wave. I placed the car on the table, not to remind myself to go back, but to remember that there had been truly good things, and they weren't erased by what came later. I didn't return, but I also didn't hold resentment. Resentment at this age is an unnecessary burden. It forces you to carry people who are no longer with you. I had carried enough. I understand that some people might think I was too cold, that a father shouldn't cut things off like that. But the truth is, I didn't cut off love. I only cut off my participation in things that harmed all of us. I didn't stop loving. I stopped allowing myself to be pulled into a role that made me lose myself. Life here moved slowly, but it wasn't empty. I joined a small book club at the town library. I helped a few neighbors fix their fences in exchange for simple dinners and unpolished life stories. I learned how to live without needing to prove anything. Each day passed without great victories, but without failures either. Just a quiet sense of enough. Some nights I sat on the porch, listening to the waves and thought about boundaries, about how I had spent my life confusing love with unconditional sacrifice. I once believed that giving everything would earn closeness, but I learned, late in life, that love without boundaries becomes an accomplice to harm, and that forgiveness does not mean continuing to allow yourself to be exploited. Sometimes walking away is not destroying a family. It is saving yourself. Peace came to me much later than it does for others. But when it came, it wasn't loud. It didn't need recognition. It was simply there, every morning, every evening, in the smallest things. And I cherished it the way I cherish my own breath. I don't know what the future will bring. I'm not sure whether one day I'll open that drawer and reply. But I know one thing for certain. I'm no longer running, and I'm no longer clinging. I'm living, in the simplest, most honest way I know how. And if you've stayed with me all the way to these final lines, I want to say a heartfelt thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to a story that isn't about victory, but about boundaries, awakening, and peace that comes late. Where are you watching from? Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? If you'd like, leave a few words to share, not to judge, just so we can know we're not alone. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the stories ahead. I'm grateful that you're here, listening, and allowing this story to carry meaning beyond the life of one person.